here. I think he terrifies the hell out of people with his tweets about, destroying civilization and all this other stuff. But I think people, even though they don't like to hear it, they've resolved for themselves that when he says he's going to get out, he will in fact get out. Of course, there was a lot of hand wringing. But if you look at the markets today, we basically bounced all the way back from where we were pre-Iran on both the S&P and the NASDAQ. If, in fact, we land the plane, if JD lands the plane, and by the way, on Lebanon, yes, they were bombing yesterday, but Netanyahu has now said that you're going to have direct government talks between Israel and Lebanon. So if we land the plane on these two things, I think it's off to the races in the market. And by the way, while everybody's focused on Iran, stay tuned. I think we're getting close to a deal on Ukraine, Russia, right? Venezuela is, kind of going seemingly very well. I think there's also going to be news on Cuba. You could envision a world, there's risk to the downside, certainly, I will stipulate. But you also have to pay attention to the risk to the upside. If you land the plane on those things, heading into America 250 July 4th, the market could really take off.
All right, well, let's maybe discussion amongst both sides of the aisle. On Tuesday, the New York Times dropped an inside the room piece on how President Trump made the decision. According to this report, if it's true, I know some people don't subscribe to the New York Times anymore or think it's fake news, but how Trump decided to basically follow Netanyahu into this war on February 11th. Netanyahu met with Trump at the White House where he gave him a 4-part pitch on attacking Iran. J.D. Vance, according to the story, if it's true, disclaimer, warned Trump that the war could cause regional chaos and break apart Trump's MAGA 2.0, the Trump 2.0 coalition we talked about here, the big tent, and that's turned out actually to be true. There's been a bunch of hand-wringing from Megyn Kelly, Tucker Carlson, right on down the line. Rubio was anti-regime change, but he was largely ambivalent, according to this story, about the bombing campaign. Susie Wiles, chief of staff, said she had concerns about gas prices before the midterms. Pretty good advice there. And General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said this of Netanyahu's pitch, quote, "Sir, this is, in my experience, standard operating procedure for the Israelis. They oversell, and their plans are not always well developed. They know they need us, and that's why they're hard selling." If you put this together with Rubio's walked back comments at the start of the war, we knew, this is a quote from Rubio, we knew there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that would precipitate an attack against American forces, and that's why we did it. I had Josh Shapiro on the All In interview show, and he talked a lot about this. There is a big underpinning here, Chamath, that the United States foreign policy is being driven by Netanyahu. Every Jewish American person I've talked to feels Netanyahu is not doing Jewish American and the Jewish diaspora any favors here by his approach to these wars. What are your thoughts on why we got into this and how we get out of it?
I mean, the person that decides is the president of the United States. So a foreign leader isn't getting to call the shots in the United States. I think very practically speaking, the markets are effectively pricing in that this was a small blip. For whatever people think, that's just what the best prediction market that we have is telling us. I think that's important to acknowledge that we're probably in the end game here. And the second thing to acknowledge is if I was Israel, I would really be concerned that unless I help find an off-ramp quickly, the risk that Israel loses America as a predictably steadfast ally could go down. And I think that that's problematic for Israel, far more than it's problematic for the United States. So all of that kind of tells me that we will find an off-ramp. A, because I think economically it makes sense. And then B, geopolitically, I think Israel will want to make sure that this doesn't burn a long-standing relationship.
Yeah, that seems to me to be the major issue here is Americans basically do not want to be in this war. Americans do not want our foreign policy being influenced to the extent they believe. So I'm not putting my belief in here, just Americans believe we are being dragged into this by Israel and that Israel has too much, or Netanyahu specifically, has far too much influence. And then people believe the anti-Semitism that's occurring here. Josh Shapiro gave me a lot of pushback on this. But all the Jewish Americans I talk to say Netanyahu is causing, with his actions in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, he's gone too far, and it's causing the anti-Semitism we're experiencing today. So you can make your own decisions about that. Any final thoughts here, Brad, on the American foreign policy being influenced too much by Israel?
No,
it's the discussion of the moment.
I mean, listen, kind of like Zach said earlier, I think that we will ultimately be judged by the outcomes, right? And that everybody is an armchair pundit today on, the approach that we're taking in these two different places. I think we could be on the verge of a massive transformation of the Gulf states. You went there with me, Jason. Saudi, Qataris, Kuwaitis, Emiratis. I've talked to a lot of them this week. I think they're very hopeful and optimistic. I think you could bring Iran into the fold. But listen, I'm an optimist on all of this stuff. I just want to remind people, doing nothing in Iran had tremendous risks. Doing nothing in Venezuela had tremendous risks. So it's not as though this was, something that I think wasn't well calculated. But I think we have to let the cards be played and then let history be the judge. But I think there's a risk in both directions, but I'm going to remain optimistic.
All right, Zach, you said in the Gaza situation, we should have a wide berth for criticism of Israel and Netanyahu. What are your thoughts on this belief here in the United States now in this discussion that Israel's having far too much influence over the United States foreign policy?
Well, I noticed in my feed today that Naftali Bennett, who's a major Israeli politician who was a former prime minister, tweeted polling that showed that Israel was becoming very unpopular in the US. And he was expressing concern about that and expressing the need to basically address that or fix that. So I think you're starting to see Israeli politicians raising that as an issue. And I think that's probably a good thing. Yeah, there it is. And it's really cool, actually, how X now just automatically translates things from foreign languages, in this case, Hebrew, and it puts it in your feed. So here's Naftali Bennett, former prime minister, saying this is a serious situation. There's a lot of work ahead of us to fix everything. Now, obviously, this is not Netanyahu. This is one of his political opponents. But yeah, I mean, this is something for Israel to consider and think about. And I think that they would improve their popularity if they got behind the ceasefire. And I have no indication that they won't, but that would certainly be a good place to start.
I have to say, just as an aside, this auto-translate feature has done more for understanding across borders than anything I've ever seen. And it is the most impressive tech feature I've seen released in years, putting AI and large language models aside. For people who don't know what's happening, because of Grok being really good at doing auto-translate, they've taken the pockets of the best of what's happening in Japan, what's happening in Israel, what's happening in France, and they're surfacing it auto-translated. Then when you reply as an American to somebody in Japan, they see it auto-translated as well, which has led to people who don't speak the same language engaging on X in a very nuanced, fun, interesting way. And that, as a truth mechanism, is just absolutely extraordinary. I think this is going to have such a profound effect. Maybe Elon and the X team should get like a Nobel Peace Prize award for this. I think it's going to change. I mean, I hate to be hyperbolic, but have you been using this feature, Chamath? Has it been coming up in your